people begin to join us as we sort of get the conversation started. But I want to welcome our three panelists here today, Michael Ighodaro, Rob Knowles, and Maureen Luba. I'll hand it over to each one to introduce themselves, but I do want to just say that we are doing this conversation as part of a series for the Research Literacy Networking Zone for the Global Village at AIDS 2020. And we were supposed to all be together in person in San Francisco and Oakland, where Rob is. It's unfortunate that we can't all be together because of the global pandemic, but what I guess is a silver lining of this is really that we can make this global village conversations global. And one of the things that came out of this meeting is the new UNAIDS report on the data of where we are right now in 2020, but data going up to 2019 for the HIV epidemic. And so we're just really digesting it, beginning to take it all in as advocates and really what those numbers mean, especially in the terms of the pandemic. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So we welcome questions and comments from the chat feature here, but also from those on Facebook and YouTube where we're streaming live. So I'm going to kick it over. We're going to actually start with the West Coast. We never do that. So start with the West Coast. Rob, who's the executive director of East Bay, of the AIDS Project of East Bay. Can you just kick it off, give a little introduction of yourself?
Sure, and welcome to Oakland. This is beautiful Lake Merritt. I have had the honor of co-chairing the local planning group for AIDS 2020. So as disappointed as I am that you all aren't here to see my lovely home, I'm excited about the work that we were able to do as a local planning group. As Jessica said, I've been executive director for AIDS Project of the East Bay for the last 5 years. We're a 37-year-old organization founded by a Black gay man in Oakland for Black gay men in Oakland. And so we're doing the work and having fun during AIDS 2020. Looking forward to this conversation.
Great. I'm going to hand it over to Maureen.
Thanks, Jess. This is Maureen Luba here from Malawi. I work for ADVOC as African Region Advocacy Advisor for a Compass project. It is an advocacy project that we're implementing in 3 countries, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. So yeah, I'm also looking forward to this conversation as we reflect on the data that is coming out of the units.
Great. Michael?
Hi, my name is Michael Ighodaro. I'm a program manager here at AVAC. I am really excited to be here today and looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So maybe I can frame it a little bit by talking about the UNAIDS report and where we are. Back in 2015, 2016, the UNAIDS came up with some targets to end the epidemic. There were 10 strategic targets that they hoped to meet by 2020, as those interim targets, ultimately to end the epidemic by 2030. And so just to recap where we are, those 10 targets were 90%, the 90 people know their status, 90 people are receiving treatment, 90 people are 90% of those individuals, 90% of those are virally suppressed. The second target was 0 new HIV infections among children and mothers alive and well. The third being 90% of young people are empowered with the skills, knowledge, and capability to protect themselves from HIV. 4, 90% of women and girls live free from gender inequality and gender-based violence. 5, 90% of people living with the risk of HIV and affected by HIV report no discrimination, especially in health, education, and workplace settings. It's key. Number 6, overall financial investment for the AIDS response in low and middle income countries reach at least 30 billion with continued increase from the current levels of the domestic public sources, so more domestic financing. 7, 90% of women and men, especially young people in high prevalence settings, have access to HIV combination prevention and sexual and reproductive health services. Number 8, 27 million additional men in high prevalence settings receive voluntary medical male circumcision as part of the integrated sexual reproductive health strategy. 90% of key populations, including sex workers, men who have sex with men, people who inject drugs, transgender people, and prisoners have access to HIV combination. And number 10, 75% of people living with HIV at risk or affected who are in need benefit from HIV-sensitive social protection. So 3 of those 10 targets focused on combination HIV prevention strategies. And where are we now? The data that just came in, 1 in 4 infections are in AGYW, so adolescent girls and young women in sub-Saharan Africa. 1.7 million new infections in 2019. 62% are in key populations. So I think the overall message is that we have not reached those targets, those milestones. And this is coming from a place before COVID-19. So we want to just begin, I think kick it off to hear your initial reflections on that. And I'm going to start with Michael, with you.
Hi again. I think for me, I do think the report is useful and it's an important tool. But I think, even more critical right now, we need the report to be responsive to situations or cases that we have right now. So for instance, from the report, we know that it stated that at least in sub-Saharan Africa, the majority of the infections globally comes from young women. And the report did not specifically, in my view, state, what needs to happen or what we need to do to make sure like advocates and activists or policymakers are listening to communities. I think the report did not, in my view, really emphasize the importance of community voices in response. So again, I'm just going to pose these questions to both Maureen and the rest of the panelists to see, in your view as an advocate, how do you think we can use this report to best advocate for the needs of communities? I think it's really important that that comes up, because I see the importance of community voices and community needs. Data is important, and we need to use data for advocacy. And if the advocacy part of it is not coming out strongly, then we need to question it and ask questions about how we need to use this report and what is the need for it right now, given where we are right now globally. Jess, I don't know if I put that question, if I use my answer as a question, but I was trying to
Well, I think that, it's a great point. This is a really informal conversation. These are just our really thoughts as individual advocates. And I think, we can use this time to ask each other questions and just digest as we would if we were all together sitting on the red couches in the global village space, So I hear you. It doesn't really reflect, you're saying it doesn't reflect community voices. I think we could take that question to others, but before Rob and Maureen, you answer that, I do just want to get what were your initial takeaways from the data itself, where we are with the numbers. So Rob, I'm going to go to you.
So I guess my initial read through of the report, I was looking at it like, there's nothing new here. There's nothing we didn't know. If you took out the term COVID-19, then this report could have been written years ago. And I think the big question, if I'm using this report and looking at it as useful in any way, then the report really stresses how COVID-19 could derail our HIV response. So the big question is, how do we ensure that COVID does not result in severe disruptions of HIV services? And what do we need to do to make sure that that doesn't happen? And I think my big positive takeaway from the report is a section that I think says, seize the moment. And I think that this moment of concurrent pandemics is a moment that we can seize. I think particularly here in the USA, where we're not just talking about coronavirus and HIV, but we're talking about a pandemic of racism, and people are at home and have time to pay attention, and hopefully that will result in some action. But so I think seizing the moment is a big takeaway for me from this report, because I think that we can use the current pandemics that people are really thinking about to buttress support for this pandemic that's been going on for 40 years.
Great. I mean, I had similar thoughts, and I definitely want us to get into where this data is and what does it mean, you know, given another pandemic that we're all in. Maureen, just some initial thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Jess, and thanks, Rob and Michael. So, I mean, once again, just to thank you, Nets, for for this report. I think when I look at this report, I think for me it's always a reminder of the reality on the ground. It's like looking at yourself in the mirror, and I think just like Michael and Robin has said. I think when I also looked at the report and I was seeing, the same, data coming up, I think the first question I asked myself, could it be because we are not making enough? And I think going through the report, I think when you look at some of the challenges or the gaps that are being highlighted, and I would say this is a song that we've been singing for years. I think just talking about the AGY debut, for example, ailing the blunt of the epidemic, this is something that we have known for quite a long time. And some of the questions I was asking myself is, are we doing justice? If you were saying this is the case in terms of AGY debut, ailing the blunt of the epidemic, but also even key populations, are we doing enough justice, in providing, these populations with the services that they need, the services that respond to their needs? So I think for me, my key takeaway, I think after looking at the report, is I think we need to work up. It's a wake up call for all of us. I think to make sure that we're doing the right things to achieve the progress that is desired. Of course, the report talks about, us not meeting the 2020 targets, even without COVID, we still couldn't have made our 2020 targets. What does that mean in really? So those are just my initial thoughts looking at the report.
Yeah, no, I think that this is all resonating with me. I think for me, I agree with your thought. Obviously, this is something that AVAC called out in our 2019 report, that we knew we were going to miss the targets, Rob, that this wasn't new, this wasn't unexpected. But I do think, for me, I reflect on it and what are these numbers saying for right now in this moment, given the global pandemic. And Michael, I will get to your question too about, the community perspective. But for me, I feel like I was struck by sort of the need for the call for additional research and the need to continue research for combination prevention, and how right now the global pandemic is we're starting to see some backlash, some sparking about research, about just some unrest in different communities, and an anti-research feeling beginning to pop up. That as somebody who knows the strength of research to lower these numbers, for me is something that's the report really crystallized. Like, this is the moment we need to talk about. We're not doing enough to get products out there, but we also need to do more research so that people have access to products that they want and they need. So it's not really a question, but I guess, what do you think that we as advocates can do to push the need and to use these numbers to champion the need for additional research, the need for additional research?
I'll just hop in real quick to talk. So just from a Black man in the United States perspective, when you start talking about rushing through vaccine research and you start talking about needing more research, I'm backing up and letting all the white people deal with that. And we have to realize that we're not talking to people that are used to dealing with HIV for the last 35, 40 years. We're talking to the general population that we're always supposed to be trying to talk to, but we may become more comfortable with understanding research and understanding the history of research, particularly in this country. But when you talk about research now more than ever, when we used to talk about it a few years ago with just people that were interested in HIV, I saw some progress with us getting through with people understanding research. Now we're going back to a wider population, and we're having to talk about Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks and all of these things again, that turn people off from research in this country. So I think that we have to be patient with the general public, because we've not been working with them. They've not been working with us for a long time. They're not used to talking about these issues. And we have to own our own expertise, I think, and be the voices for people in our community and to people in our communities.
Yeah, I mean, just following up on that, I think for me, I feel like the last AVAX report really really emphasized a lot of my views, a lot of the things I think we should, be pushing more for. I think, yes, we need research and we need those evidence, but we need those evidence to guide tomorrow's prevention targets. Like, if the evidence and research we're getting is not guiding the targets that we have, then there's a problem, right? I think, the reason why we are where we are today is that, we are not using grassroots leadership, to demand for accountability. I mean, we are doing that as much as we can, but I think there's a roadblock about how people listen to the demands of the community and how people really take actions, right? When I look at this report, I see a list of actions, but not a list of how those actions can be taken, and not a list of how, the how is missing in the what. So we have the what is the problem, the data is the data we have, like more than 60% of new infections are happening with key populations. That's the what. But what is the how? What we need to do? Yes, demand for accountability from government, from policymakers, but how are we going to do it? I think for an advocate's point of view, we need to be able to articulate that very well and fight for increase. And in my view, there are 4 things, critical things that we need to be asking for or using this report to demand for, fight for increase in domestic financing for health and HIV, demand the end of criminalization and stigmatization based on gender and sexual identity. Then amplify the voice of women and girls. That is really important, right? And key populations, obviously, but I think, just amplifying the voice of people and making sure they are not just in table to take the buses, but also making sure their demands and their asks are actually followed up on. I think also for activists and advocates, we need to move past just being able to be on a steering committee or on an expert committee. If you're going to be on an expert committee or on a steering committee, you need to be able to demand that how is my voices in this committee going to lead to changes that I need in my community, right? I think that is the what. And I think, again, just referring back to AVAX report, things we need to do now is really listed there. And I think the new UNAIDS report need to work side by side. So in my view, the new UNAIDS report is what is happening. And the AVAC report is how we need to make sure those things happen. And we need to find a way to make sure advocates take AVAC report. Again, this is not because I work for AVAC, but I'm just saying, use that report to really, really, really amplify the data that UNAIDS is representing, and use AVAC report to strategize and use strategy on how we're going to implement the things that we need to see in our communities.
So I do want to hand it over Oz, but I'm sorry, Marie. Oz has had his hand raised for a little bit, so I want to make sure he gets his point in as well.
Hi, everyone. This is Oz from Turkey. Love the discussion so far. I just want to point out one thing. The way the UNAIDS collects these data, the reports are produced on the data that is collected from the government, right? Mm-hmm. And the data already shows to us that we are falling behind on the goals that we thought we were going to reach. But we should also be aware there are countries like Turkey, where I live, do not give any data to UNAIDS. So we actually do not know what the epidemic is like in Turkey, for example. And when we say Turkey, we're talking about 80, 90 million people. And with COVID-19, we have seen that it takes 1-2 people to bring a pandemic or an epidemic back. So I think we also need to talk about, yes, we are falling behind, but there are parts like pocket epidemics or pocket locations that we cannot still reach into. And I think as advocates, we still need to push for global support for those locations, because it kind of becomes like a cycle. If there is not data, then you cannot get funds. If there's not funds, you cannot hold the government accountable. So maybe we should also be focusing more, we should also find those locations where we cannot get data from, because even if the rest of the country, the rest of the world reaches the goals, if you lose 90 million people, HIV is going to come back, and we do not want that. We are still dealing with the same thing for COVID. And so I think that is also an interesting thing to talk about. What are those hidden pockets? Where are the hidden epidemics? How can we hold those governments accountable? How can we support the communities there? Because also the global AIDS monitoring also works in two steps. First, the UNAIDS has to get the data from the government, then they reach out to the communities, because without the government's first reports and data, the stories and support they get from the communities do not make sense. So for example, when you go to Turkey's counterfact sheet on UNAIDS website, it's completely empty. There's no data from the communities because they cannot even get to the second step because government is not giving in any data. So I think this is like an interesting aspect to it. The data we have shows that we are falling behind, but there are also so much data we actually do not have yet. Just wanted to put this in.
That's a really excellent point to bring into the mix. And I really appreciate you kind of adding into this conversation. We do want this to be an open dialogue. And that's a great question to kind of address and bring in. So Maureen, I apologize, I cut you off before, so I want to make sure I get to you and your points, and then we can kind of circle back around.
Yeah, so thanks, Jess. I think one thing that is very clear also from the report, just like I've said, is we're not doing well in terms of HIV prevention. I think we've seen that in terms of when you look at HIV infections. And I just wanted to go back to the issue of the need for more research, to discover more tools that meet the needs of different populations, even target populations. And I think with that, I also just wanted to talk about equitable access, right? Once these tools, these new tools are available, who gets access, right? I think we need to also start looking at, making sure that, once the tools are available, the people that need the tools, regardless of your geographical location, social, economic status, but the people that need it should have access to the tools, because it's of no use, for us to be really moving towards, discovery, the discovery of new tools, investing in a lot of research, to discover new tools. Yet once these tools are available, we're even failing to make sure that, there are those that need these tools, are accessing the tools, right? I think a good example is how I think we are failing in making sure that PrEP, for instance, is accessible to all who need it. I don't want to even go to the issue of pricing, how the pricing of some of these tools is done. But I think as we equitable access, I think, to some of these new tools, but also even access to HIV services in general. I think it's something that we need to start looking at, especially for those geographical locations, but also populations that are marginalized. How are we making sure that, their, social economic status, does not determine whether they have access to these the services they need. Yeah.
Great, and so we did have some really nice just messages from Nita that have come in as well, just to make sure that this idea that community voice is not being reflected, and maybe we could talk a little bit about that piece as well. So Michael, I know you would ask the question of, I guess, do others think that the community voice is represented in this report? And then I guess I would follow on to say, and like you said, Michael, we have to talk about the hows. How are we going to get that community voice reflected in the work ongoing from 2020 to 2030? So whoever wants to start, I'm not gonna, you just sort of thinking, what do other, Michael, we heard your perspective about you don't feel like the community voice is represented. I guess Maureen, Rob, what are your thoughts there?
I guess I would just add, so my community would say, we've done the research, we know what the problems are, let's fix the problems. The UNAIDS report says that the barriers to ending AIDS are stigma, discrimination, inequality. Those aren't new things. We know that gender-based violence, criminalization of HIV, criminalization of sex work, criminalization of drug use, criminalization of sexuality are the things that cause access issues, right? Those are things that prevent you from seeking care or seeking treatment or seeking prevention services. So if we know that those are the barriers to ending AIDS, then we have to address stigma and discrimination and inequalities regardless of what the data tell us. If they're in places where there is no data, there are still problems with stigma, discrimination, and inequalities. And so if we can address those three things, then we can end AIDS, right? And I think this is the opportunity when people are worried about coronavirus, and in this country, we see that coronavirus disproportionately affects people of color, and people are paying attention. When we see police violence disproportionately affecting people of color, and people are paying attention, we can use this opportunity to say, this disease disproportionately affects people of color in way, like in this country, I think it's like 23% of deaths for COVID are Black people, about 23.5% of deaths from police violence are Black people, but 44% of deaths from HIV are Black people. So I think this is an opportunity for us to seize the moment, as the UN report suggests, and hold people's feet to the fire to get stuff really done on stigma, discrimination, and inequalities.
I'm really with you there. I agree. I think, yes, I agree. I think the community voices are represented and the how isn't there, but having another report where the data is saying we knew that it was going to happen, and it happened. This data came out before COVID. This is our moment. This, like you said, Rob, this is really our moment to seize, to say, hey, community needs to be part of this. Look at what we need to do. How do we get a trans commitment to a research agenda? How do we get those voices represented? To Oz, to your point, I challenge you to that question. How can we challenge UNAIDS to get more data from countries that are underrepresented in this report? Because we know that they're doing it, and I love that you raised that point, because I don't think that is raised enough in these forums. And you see that we're shrinking in sub-Saharan Africa, but we're growing. The epidemic is growing in other areas, particularly Southern America, Latin America. But we don't know what's sort of happening in Turkey, and perhaps Eastern Europe is having other pockets. So I think that it's a really great point that you raised. Maureen, just to finish out this idea about community voices, how did that speak to you?
Yeah, so I mean, community involvement has always and will always be key, I think, as far as fighting epidemics is concerned. And I think what we're seeing is, I think, of course, there's been improvement in some areas, in some parts of the world, where we've seen the space for civil society kind of like opening up, while in other places it's kind of like closing up. So I think there's been a lot of talk about ensuring that communities are involved. What does that mean? And I think whilst, people have been talking about community involvement, I think it's important to make sure that the communities are being capacitated, to make sure that they are participating in the response, right? And when I talk about capacitating resources, making sure that the communities have that resource. Sometimes it's easier, for stakeholders to say, oh, we want community, civil society to be part of this conversation, or to lead, for example, community mobilization, or to increase awareness, right? But how much investment and or capacity building are we putting in to make sure that the civil society, the communities are capacitated to effectively participate in the response? So yes, community, but I think increasingly people are realizing the importance of having communities part of this discussion, having communities part of the response. But I think there's still a lot that needs to be done in making sure that communities have the resources, have the capacity, and not just but the resources specifically. I want to emphasize on the point of resources, have the resources to make sure that they are effectively participating in the
Great, and I think, this leads into Neetha's question, which is, what is the role advocates play in the discussions about access, particularly around cabotegravir, which we know after hearing HBTN 083, that those results, they are extremely effective in MSM and transgender women. We do not have the data yet for long-acting cabotegravir in cisgender women, potentially. We'll see after the DSMB review later this year, but what does that mean for access? And I think, how does that play into, again, that was one of the targets that, you know, we want to impact adolescent girls and young women, to provide access, meet women where they are. They represent over 50% of the new infections this year in sub-Saharan Africa. So what is the role of advocates to take this data, another year of missing the targets, but really hold feet to the fire? What can we say around that cabotegravir issue? I guess I would start off by just saying that, yes, advocates play a huge role. I think this is part of the arsenal, but I do, you know, I do worry that we are, I don't want to miss this moment. You know, I think that this is the time, you know, to say, to in some ways capitalize on the COVID experience, to say, hey, we need to, like, research can happen fast and we can get products out fast. You can manufacture things very quickly and we can get access very quickly. So let's do, you know, let's make sure that we are being safe, but also, you know, getting these products scaled up in countries seriously. And I think that that's what I would say personally our role as advocates could be.
I mean, in places where there is universal access to healthcare, where there's a national healthcare program, then that's great. We can cheer for access for everybody. But in places where there's no universal healthcare, then we need to be advocating for that. I think when we think about our advocacy, we have to get outside of advocating for specific HIV specific things and advocate for whole people. And whole people need healthcare for their entire lives, not just to protect them from HIV or treat them for HIV. We need universal healthcare across the board. Universal means that all through the universe, we need healthcare for free for people. And that would help some of the access issues. And then I'll go back again to the discrimination and racism and sexism and misogyny that permeates many of our institutions. Those are the biggest barriers to people getting care that they need.
Great. Michael, you have any thoughts?
I think you guys have reflected all of the thoughts that I had. I think it's just like there is a sense of people saying they're like tired of the same old tactics, the same old information being shared. Like, yes, we know we are affected. Yes, we know like things are happening to us in like, you know, in drastic ways, but like we need solutions. And I think we need to be part of leading those solutions. And I think we have said we know the answers. I don't think we don't know the answers. I think community knows the answers to solving the issues that we have in our communities. But I think we need a platform to build, not just to share those solutions or answers, but actually to implement the solutions. And we need funding to implement solutions. I think if you go to Kenya or San Francisco or Nairobi or anywhere, you meet a young woman or MSM or a trans person, like they can articulately tell you what the solutions to their problems are. What they are missing is listening ear and funding the actions that they've asked for. And I think that is what we need right now. I think like moving forward and how we move forward is part of how we fund the solutions that advocates are asking for. So I think again, like yes, my sense is the report is great. Like, you know, it's sharing information, sharing data, and I think from advocates' point of view is now we have those tools. We've had those tools for more than 10 years now, but then we're tired of just getting the tools. We want the tools to include solutions and commitment from donors, from government on how we implement the solutions. I think that is what the report needs to change to become, not just providing data of such situations, but also part of the report needs to be how we solve those issues and how we fund those issues and how we make sure advocates are part of the solutions that we're creating. I mean, that we're putting out. So again, it's why I'm frustrated with the report, that it doesn't include solutions of how we actually solve the issues that the data is bringing out.
So I think we're really saying a lot of the same things, and I think I want to, you know, start to wrap up our conversation and bring it to a close, but make sure we're bringing it to a close looking forward. So how how are we going to seize this moment? And I do think that, the report does talk about the overlapping pandemics. And yes, from a historic perspective, how HIV has sort of begun to move further, but what are we going to do and commit, or, thinking about committing as advocates to seizing the moment we're in to really to stop some of the predictions that are laid out in the report about potential drug shortages and things like that. How do we use this moment to further the goals of, like you said, Michael, the people, the young, MSM that you meet in Nairobi or San Francisco or Sao Paulo or wherever it is that you're going? How do we take this moment to, put those solutions into place and begin to hold feet to the fire? What is the step for us? And Michael, I'm going to start with you just to challenge, last thoughts, what is our steps? What is the next step here?
I think we have the structures in place. I think the next step is utilizing those structures, right? We have like community-led networks, we have community-led organizations, and we have community-led strategies. I think it's like part of how we move forward is like making sure governments are listening to them and they're getting the right people in the room. If one of the way we move forward could be that if you're an advocate anywhere and someone invites you to join a panel, like I said earlier on, your first question is to be not the panel, but like steering committee. Your first question is to be, what is my participation in this panel needs to lead to? What are the actions that my conversation or my input into this steering committee will lead to? I think that is part of asking those hard questions and being able to say no. Like, if you're not going to commit to A and B for me to be part of this steering committee, I don't want to be part of it. Like, stepping back and say, we're tired of just being part of steering committees and expert groups just for the sake of it. Like, we want demands, and also being able to articulate our own actions and how it leads to actual changes, and being able to use data to demand for critical actions that we want to see. So again, it's just like we have those structures in place, we have those strategies in place, is utilizing them and make sure the right people are in the right place at the right time.
Great. To Maureen, last thoughts.
Yeah.
What are the next steps?
Yeah, so I think for me, what I'm expecting to see is, I think some of the issues that have been highlighted in the report, I expect to see, these elements, these challenges, these gaps, informing the next conversations that, civil society activists, advocates, we're going to have, in the next few months with policymakers, with the donors, with program implementers, with government. And I hope that this will not by the end of the day, it will not become just one of those reports where we talk about it and then maybe 1 month down the line, we forget about it, we forget about the reality on the ground, and then we continue business as usual. I expect, to see different stakeholders at globally, but also at country, specifically at country level, doing, taking a more reflection, reflecting on the reality, on the ground, but also I think it will be good, of course. I think, like you said earlier on, this report was written, taking into consideration the impact that COVID has had on the HIV response. So already, I know the conversation, even in fact, in COVID-19, it's even going to look different. So I think what I expect to see is us, as civil society, as policymakers, donors, and program implementers, kind of like reflecting on the reality and coming up with strategies and solutions that will actually help us to achieve the targets that we continue to meet, and we have continued to meet for a long time. So I expect to see something that is business as usual, if I may put it that way.
Rob?
So, I'm in Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco, who's been really successful at addressing their HIV epidemic, and Oakland has not. And so I think this report tells us that we need to do a couple of things. We can do more than one thing at once. We have to fight for additional funding. And I think this is an opportunity in this moment globally where additional funding is available, particularly around racial justice issues. I've had people calling, trying to get their staffs trained on racial justice issues. What does HIV and racial justice look like? So I think we have to fight for funding in this environment, and we have to keep it moving. We have to do the things that we've known to do for years. We have to fight for universal health care. We have to fight for decriminalization of HIV and sex work. We have to fight for pharmaceutical company reform, whatever that looks like. I don't know if it's enforcing patents or it's not enforcing patents that's going to help us get in the epidemic. But we've got to take this opportunity where people are inspired, where people are affected by public deaths of Black people, and where people have the time to pay attention to these issues and listen. I think this is an opportunity for us to kind of get the money and get the structural changes that we need. Like, if we don't seize this moment, then when is the next best time to do it? And so I'm trying to look at it as a glass half full thing, because this report was disappointing, but it leaves room for us to do what we've already known we needed to do.
I think that that's actually a really great place to end the conversation today. But you're right. You know, this is the moment of this report. We knew that it was coming, and we could have written it. You know, we could have seen that data, but we're reading it in a time where people are truly listening, where people are actually asking for community input. You know, people want to get advocates to the table. You know, for this, be it COVID-19 research, but they want to hear voices about racial justice. They want to know how they can do better. So how do we seize on this moment? And I'll end just with, again, Nita put out a great piece in the Q&A. It's, you know, maybe we do need a monitoring and evaluation outcome as part of UNAIDS reporting. You know, maybe this is something where we can say that's a good place to get community data, community voices in, and to say it's not just about the numbers that we're tracking, but it's also about holding these big things that we're saying, these big advocacy points accountable. So just some food for thought for us all to continue to digest. The report is only 4 days old, so we're not going to get a lot out of it, but I appreciate all of your time in the conversation today, thinking about where we are, and thinking about all of that today. So thank you all. Thank you so much to our panelists, and we appreciate everything today.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Ava,
Jess.
for having the conversation.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.